to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
On the agenda, we have the proposed new zoning order. We have a public hearing last week. And I'm wondering if anybody on the town board had any thoughts on the comments that the residents made at that public hearing.
I had three specific things I think we should consider in some kind of specific way. The first was the comment about removal of garbage cans and putting them in a contained area, something like that. I assume that the issue is that if they're not in a contained area, that they'll blow around and be back on the road, which is why it was written that way. And I was wondering if we could do it in some way where it worded it that they had to be placed in a way that they were contained, but not in a building, secured, but not necessarily in a building. So it was less work for people as an approach to that problem. That was one. The second was the issue of the night lights. And I thought the way that was worded, the comment was worded, it implied that this person would not be able to use his lights, and he would not be able to play tennis. My assumption is that that issue is grandfathered, that he does not have to add downward shields to his lights that already exist. I just wanted that clarified. Although I think the actual regulation makes sense moving forward. It's a very common one. I do think that makes sense. And the third isn't really a change in the zoning law, but the issue about the comprehensive plan. And it's come up several times, and I just think the board needs to respond to the community in some very concrete way, making it clear that we intend to review that and have a committee that begins that process as soon as possible and tie it to an ongoing evaluation of what we're doing. Those are my three thoughts.
Well, certainly with the passing of this law, hopefully this year, and some experience that the planning board and zoning board can get under their belt under the new law, then the formation of a comprehensive review plan is in order. I think that we'll plan to do that sometime this fall. I had a couple of items, and one of them was the fines and imprisonment statements that were made, and I'll ask our land use attorney, John Lyons, to clarify that.
Yes, Maria. So the sections that were, some concerns were expressed about at the public hearing regarding fines and possible imprisonment are actually provisions that are in many zoning laws in New York State, in particular up and down the Hudson Valley. And it really provides municipalities with options to, they actually have under that provision an option to enforce their zoning law civilly by going to Supreme Court and getting injunctive relief to stop a person from violating the law, or they can proceed on a criminal basis. And as I said, that's something that is very common. And it's not a new provision in zoning laws. It is, however, something that's extremely rarely exercised by municipalities. vast majority of cases, enforcement is taken care of by an order to remedy by the building department, and in most cases, citizens are, comply with that. On occasion, appearance tickets are written, and there's an appearance in court, and most of the time, those are resolved again with an agreement on the part of the person who's accused of the violation of agreeing to come in compliance. I've been practicing land use law since the 80s, and I don't know, I haven't come across any occasions in which somebody's gone to jail because of a zoning violation. But the provisions are in there because every once in a while a circumstance comes along which presents a serious set of circumstances, or someone who is a particularly flagrant violator of the law, and the option is there. I have been involved in cases where municipalities have gone to Supreme Court to obtain court injunctions to stop behavior that's violating the law. So it's there so that there's an option on the part of municipalities to enforce in extreme cases, but it's rarely exercised.
Okay, thank you, John. Kevin, did you have anything you wanted to, Bob?
Well, one of the comments that was made was regarding the definitions and how they were not well created, and I just wanted to point out that all the definitions have been created with the guidance of both Nan and reviewed by our land use attorney. They are as good as they can be. So I don't know why that statement was made when we obviously have professionals that are helping us and doing it well. That's all.
John, Nan, do you want to review the county planning board letter? And then the comments from the town planning board?
The county, oops, this is the old one. So there were two reviews done by the county. The second one recently to reflect the changes that were done the last time in between the two public hearings to the short-term rental section. So it was, their overall conclusion was that it was approved and that it did not have any countywide significance. They did have some recommendations, which they call informal comments, offered for consideration, and out of the there were five recommendations. 4 of them reflected the discrepancy between the definitions that are listed in the definition section and the definitions that are listed in the short-term rental section. And if you recall, I sent a memo or an email, was it a memo or just an email, to the town board when I discovered that that we had updated the definitions in the short-term rental, but those had not gotten translated into the other definition sections. So that's a housekeeping issue. They noticed it, which was good, and that's we just need to either have them in both places exactly the same or just one place, so we don't have a conflict between one and the other. The other comment that they made was that they suggested that consideration be given to including the requirement for site plan review for establishment of the larger short-term rental use categories, class 3 and 4. And my comment back to you on that one is that the way the special, so those are short-term rentals that would need a special use permit from the planning board. And the way the special use planning, or the special use permit process is written and has always been written is that site plan review and it is just a part of special use permitting process. So it's kind of by definition and by how the special use permit section is written, it's already included.
Includes it.
Yeah, so, you know, I don't know if that could be clarified or if it needs to be clarified, but, you know, I think the draft had already addressed those. So we do have to do the housekeeping to get the two sets of definitions the same. And you can decide whether you, on your advice, whether they're better served in the definition section all in one place or keep those that relate to short-term rental in the short-term rental section. Wherever, doesn't matter as long as we address it.
What was your suggestion?
Well, I think we should just sync them up and leave them, I think it'll be easier to have them. The reason that we decided to pull them out, and normally we have the definitions just in the definition section and that's it, but when we thought that if somebody were to come and to take a look at the short-term rental section, we wanted it to be a complete resource for somebody that's looking at it, so you would be able to just read that section without having to move back and forth to other places in the zoning law, and we thought that it would make it a more it would read and have a better flow, and you'd be able to understand the terms as you're reading them. So that was the decision, that was the reason why we decided to incorporate some definitions in this section, and also because of the level of interest in the section on the part of Chatham citizens. So it was a little bit of an unusual approach, but I think if we put them in both places, then they'll be easily found in whatever place the reader decides to go to try to see what those definitions are.
Agree?
I think so
Yeah,
too.
I agree.
All right, comments from the town planning board?
Do you want to talk about that, Nan?
No, you want to? I mean, I can broadly.
Yeah,
Not line by
why don't you
line.
go ahead?
Broadly, appears that the planning board gave a very thorough review. They found a few places that, just from a grammar and clarity point of view, they had some suggestions that were to strengthen, so that we didn't have any misinterpretations of what we meant. There were a few comments that maybe went a little beyond just this needs to be rewritten to be clarified. Like the one, and I have to go back to earlier versions. There was a line missing from the table that gives the sign dimensions. It was blank, and the copy that they reviewed, it was blank. So I have to go back to earlier versions and find out what happened with that. I don't know if it was there and it got missed or what happened. So I'm gonna have to look into whether it just didn't get transferred into a further draft or what came from the committee. So I'm gonna have to do a little research on that one. So I would say, I didn't count them up, but I would say the vast majority of them were clarification statements and comments. There were a couple points, and I don't have it with me, I didn't copy it out, so I have to refer to the digital version that they sent. There were a few things that you had made decisions on that I think they commented on, and you can look at those. You can give you have to read through the whole document. Their comments are in comment boxes. So, broadly, without going line by line, that's, the general gist of where they were at. There were, I think, some really good points they made on clarification that we could make to improve.
Did you find any of them to be substantive changes?
I would leave that to John to decide what substantive. The one that I just don't know, about the sign dimensions. I don't know if that was just a typo that we just didn't include from one version to the next, or how that got to be blank. I just don't know. I have to go back to prior versions and look that up.
Yeah, there are some of them that might be substantive changes. I would have to take a look at those, take a look at the cases to see, to kind of sharpen the point on that. But if there are changes that you're interested in making on the basis of that recommendation, if you let me know, I can get back to you.
Mhm. So that would involve us going through page by page. Actually, I should say page by page, because
Well,
there's
Comment by comment.
there's tens upon tens of pages where there's no comments.
Right, yes.
They're isolated places.
Right.
So comment by comment.
Yeah.
And the lot line adjustment comment that had been made by the planning board is something that is being picked up already with the subdivision.
subdivision.
You
Yeah, that-
responded to Angus on that one.
Right. Yeah, so that's not a zoning document issue. That's already addressed in the subdivision draft.
Right.
So, yeah, so I don't, how do you recommend that we?
Well, I think anything that's a clarification, we can just pick up. We're not changing the substance with regard to clarifications.
Right.
So I think we pick up whatever changes were suggested by the planning board. And anything beyond that, then it's up to the town board to decide whether you want to adopt the comments that were more substantive.
Do you want us to go through and address the clarity, grammar type things, and then winnow that list of comments down to the ones that
Need to be considered.
need to be considered? Right.
Okay.
Because that's where I thought some of them were sitting right on the edge of just cleaning it up to actually maybe making it different. And
Yes.
I didn't see, nothing really stood out to say, oh, this is different. It was more, this just makes it
Better.
better.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and the vast majority of them were that way. Yeah.
If not all.
Yeah, and the only one, like that I said, that was a red flag to me was the one about the sign dimensions. And that, I don't even, like I said, I have to research and see if just one version, it didn't get picked up from one version to the next.
I know we didn't make any changes to that section, so it must have just been,
So they were
Yeah.
discussed since I've been on the board.
Yeah, I don't know. I just can't comment because I have to go back and research what was done and said on earlier versions. It might have been that the line was put in and you didn't intend to have a dimension there, and so the line is wrong. I have to, we have to look that up.
So we don't have this yet, correct?
From the planning board?
Yeah.
Yeah, they got sent out Friday?
Over the weekend.
Yeah, Friday,
on
maybe?
Saturday.
It came in as a PDF, Angus Eaton is the author.
Oh, yes, I did look.
That's fine.
Yes.
And there was, I think there was a Word file and a PDF
Yeah,
file.
and-
Yeah.
and they redlined it all the way through.
Yeah.
They say, you'll see 30, 40 pages where there's not a comment, and then there's 4 or 5 all at once.
So you can handle the environmental assessment form?
Yes, is that the next on the agenda?
So,
Yeah.
just so I understand the process that we followed, that you're gonna take the document that came back from planning board, clean up the editorials that are beneficial, and then things that seem to be substantive or controversial, is that another word we use?
Well, I don't think that's true, that's really not, sorry, Michael, but I don't think that's a good description, I think that.
Well, I think about, sometimes there's things called friendly amendments,
Mhm.
and they're just taken that way, they're not controversial, there's,
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's a clarification, that's good. It's not going to cause anybody concern, that's what I'm referring to,
Okay.
friendly amendment type things.
Well, I think
But
I,
things that are there, they're like, whoa, that's really a difference.
well, I think anything that changes the intent of the policy
Yeah.
that's set is your decision.
Right.
You know, if it's just wording, like, here's a better way of saying the same thing, that, I think, is a housekeeping item.
Okay.
But anything that changes the intent, you have to make the decision on
So
that.
the referral to the planning board is typically done because the planning board has an expert, they have a big role in actually implementing the law once it's passed, and they have experience and expertise in handling, the provisions, applicable provisions of the present law. And so one thing you're looking for to just make sure that the procedures that are being established under the new law are something that's going to work as a practical matter at the planning board, and whether from their practical experience they have any insights that they want to share with you. Then beyond that, when you start going into matters of policy, as Nan said, policy making is the jurisdiction of the town board. And so that, that's up to you. The planning board can make suggestions, and they often do make suggestions on these types of referrals, but ultimately the decision is yours with regard to that.
So my question would be that as we go through that exercise, that would also be an opportune time then to discuss any other type of changes from what we've heard from the last public hearing.
Well, you weren't here, but we did go around the table and there were several comments that were made relative to the public hearing.
Were changes or just comments?
No, just discussion comments. So I don't know if you want to take a little break from this conversation and go back that way, if you have anything to say, but, no. Okay.
No, my concern would be that there's an opportunity as we go through there, that there have been some times that the public had made a point that we make certain that we've considered that. But this is it. It's the time to go through and touch them as we go through.
And you can do that at any time. Depending on what the changes are, we may have to take a step back in the process, but you can really do that any time up to the point where you're finalizing your seeker review and obviously before adoption.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so, the secret process is required, and it's a three-parter, so I thought we would just review what each part does, just to get everyone back up to speed on what each part does, and then our main goal for tonight is to go through part two. So, in seeker, there's two kinds of directions an environmental review can go. One is through what's called the short form, and one is through what's called the full environmental assessment form. Because this zoning law affects, so the state has established different criteria that basically tells you which direction it goes. You can use the short form for some things and the full environmental assessment form for other things. And because the zoning affects changes in land use that affects more than 25 acres, I mean, it affects the whole town. So that puts it into what's called a type 1 seeker action. And so that means we start our environmental review by using the full environmental assessment form. Both the short and the full have the same three parts, but different kind of a little more complex with the full environmental assessment form, to delve into it in more detail. So what you had, I don't know, a month ago or so, I forget when it was that we did it, I submitted to you the part 1, which is really a description about the action. So your action is adoption of the zoning law. And the form that's used, while it's quite lengthy, it's 13 pages, there's really only half of one page that's actually filled out when a municipality, when the action is adoption of a local law. So because there's no digging, there's no site, there's no parcel, there's no site specific information to fill out for that. So on the part 1 is basically, the form itself is basically empty because you're only filling out a small portion of it. And the main part of part 1 is that section F narrative, which I gave you, which is a much more detailed description of what you're proposing. And so it highlights what we've done and in a much more detailed way. And so we wanted to be detailed to show what the purpose of your action is to update the zoning law, and how it came to be. It tied into the summary of the environmentally oriented sections of the comprehensive plan. So remember, when we're doing an environmental review, our thought process has to be as to how the state defines the environment, which is fairly broad. It includes a lot of things, but not other things. It includes community character and neighborhood character, and your typical environmental features like impact on air and water, wetlands, streams, wildlife, and those kinds of things, public health and things like that. So some of the things in the comprehensive plan that were not related to the environment, and the zoning doesn't address those things, are not discussed. So what the section F does is it goes through, so there's always a piece in here that describes the environmental setting of the town or of the action, and that's basically the comprehensive plan that describes all the resources, all the maps. That document has all the soils information and the wetlands and the floodplains. All of that is very detailed in the comprehensive plan. So we refer this section F narrative to the comprehensive plan that describes all of those things. All of those, those are mostly static, like the soils don't change, the slopes don't change, things like that. So the rest of it goes section by section, consistent with the how seeker is organized by topic, and describes, well, how does the zoning address water? How does it address steep slopes? How does it address wildlife habitats, or in those types of things? So that's what the part 1 is, really a narrative to describe how the zoning addresses or was written to address those environmental topics. So I know you had looked at that and had a resolution about accepting the part 1. Just any lingering questions on the part 1 at this point? Okay. So the rest of the seeker analysis is part 2 and part 3. Part 2, this is your opportunity to evaluate whether the adoption of the zoning law has any adverse impacts on the environment. And the part 2 is really a series of questions that you need to ask and discuss to put into context, is the adoption of this zoning law going to have any impacts on the community? And you'll notice in the form that it asks you whether it has no impact, a small impact, There's another, no or small impact, or a moderate to large impact. So at this point in phase part 2, we're not evaluating whether those are significant impacts or not. In seeker, the key is that you can identify impacts, but they may be small or insignificant, and that's okay. You may identify significant impacts that then need further evaluation. So part 2 is designed to help you do 2 things. Identify whether there are any potential adverse impacts, and to decide if those are small or moderate or large. Small impacts are not looked at as needing further evaluation. If you identify anything as having a moderate or to a large impact on the environment, then when we get to part 3, we look at each one of those and say, are any of those significant adverse impacts? And so the ultimate question that seeker asks are, is there any potential significant adverse impacts to the environment? So those are all key words: potential, significant adverse impacts.
And I assume that this is always in reference to negative impact, not positive impact.
Correct. Right, correct. In the section, yes, there could be a lot of positive impacts, but the analysis ultimately focuses on the adverse impacts. So when we get to part 3, then depending on how you make some decisions from part 2, that will determine the avenue that we have to go in our discussion for part 3. So it's really, I think it's, you go through one at a time, because one leads to the next. There's really no easy way to do this other than to start with question 1 and go through that. So that's what we're going to do. And so the difficult thing about doing a seeker analysis on a local law like this is that the actual, and you jump in here, but the actual action of simply adopting a law, versus going out and bulldozing something, has no impact, because you're not, it's not physically doing anything to the environment. So you what I look at it, my perspective on it is you look at is if this zoning were implemented, someone actually uses the zoning and follows it through, will use of the zoning law adversely impact the environment? So it's kind of a two-parter.
Let's try a hypothetical. That there is a camp that wants to come in, and they want to do this on a county road, because we have limitations of camps on to the dirt roads. And of course, this law allows that to happen, but then there's aspects of noise and lighting, for example. So we have a local law now that allows a camp to be put in on a county road. They would have to get a site plan review and maybe a special use permit. And part of what they'd be looking at would be the lighting and the parking that could have a negative impact.
And that individual application would have its own seeker analysis.
Right, that's why I brought this up as an example. So the local law has the potential of having a negative impact because it allows this to happen.
That is potential.
Yep.
You can also look at it in relationship to, the other kind of outlook on it is in relation to what you have now and the zoning that you have now. So let's take the camp.
Yeah.
Maybe, and I don't know, I have to look it up, but let's say camps are allowed now and they're just permitted and they just kind of go. Or even if they have site plan review, they go through a process, but the new law has specific standards for camps to follow. So we've added in development standards for some uses that are even more protective than what you have now. So the action of adopting the law, yes, it could create the opportunity for something to adversely impact the environment to come in, but the action of adopting the zoning law, you've done it to provide additional development standards to be more protective.
A starker contrast would be where a community is weighing, adopting a zoning law for the first time. So you would be comparing a situation where there really isn't much in the way of regulation for how land can be used, where there's no zoning in place. And then if zoning is in place, there are many more controls, and generally there's a scheme that's much more protective of the environment than the situation where zoning is absent. So you're looking at what Nan's trying to say is that as we go through this environmental assessment form, part 2, you're going to see that in many ways it assumes that there's some project that requires alteration to the physical environment, because in the vast majority of cases that's what the lead agency is looking at. But so there'll be many of these things that there won't be a ready answer because they don't really apply. If adopting the zoning law isn't going to have an impact on bedrock. But there are provisions in here, especially when we get into areas like community character and where the zoning law is actually going to be is going to have a potentially significant impact on those types of categories. So you'll see, this will make more sense to you as we make our way through the form. And DEC sort of ended up recognizing this because they ended up customizing the EAF Part 1 to accommodate these kind of situations after years of municipalities going through a form that really didn't fit for the adoption of land use laws. So there's a recognition that this is a little bit unusual, but.
So in your thought process as we go through, there's kind of like I look at it as many hats. So on one hand, you're looking at the action of adopting the zoning law, and also is what that particular zoning law is trying to accomplish for the town in terms of environmental protection or not. So you kind of have to look at, when I go through these, that's kind of how I look at it.
Another example would be if a theoretical municipality decided, we've got a main road here and it's just residential along that road, and our decision as a municipality is that we want to invite big box retail to go up and down this particular strip. That's an instance where changing the zoning to facilitate that kind of development, that's an example that would show you, all right, that's raising issues where there are potential adverse impacts to the environment that a lead agency looking at the review of that type of law would have to consider seriously.
So, ready?
Ready.
All right, so the first, you all have copies of that? Yeah, okay.
Do you have a hard copy?
I have one hard copy with me. I didn't bring extra copies. I hand
I have it on
that
my
out.
tablet if you want
Do you
to.
want to send it over to them? Just
Oh, yeah, sure.
try to find the file.
Sure, yeah, I know, I'll find it, I'll send it to you. I just, I'll forward it right now.
Yeah, it's no longer on my Gmail line.
Okay.
If you just plug it into your browser, Michael, the DEC one will come right up.
DEC links discussed last week.
Yeah.
No,
It's hidden in there.
oh, it's part 2, not part 1,
Part two,
sorry, I got the
yeah,
wrong
part
one,
two.
yeah, I got the wrong one.
DEC.
It was May 6th, I think.
Thank you, I'm there.
Okay.
Yep, there it is. Report 2 block. There you go.
The part 2.
Part 2.
Part 2. We're set. Thank you.
Okay.
That's the 6th, May 6th.
Okay, so the first question is related to the impact on land. And that, the question is, does proposed action may involve construction on or physical alteration of the land surface of the proposed site? You know, again, these are oriented mostly to construction projects. So if you look down on the list of what it is, and this is not an exclusive list, but you can add other things, but it's looking at depth to water table, slopes of 15% or greater. The action involved construction on bedrock. The action involves excavation or removal of more than 1,000 tons of natural material. Multiple phases and over more than a year. The proposed action may result in increased erosion or may be located within a coastal erosion hazard area, which we don't have yet. So so the question is, you know, again, and I look at it in this two-parter, the action of the zoning, of adopting the zoning law doesn't impact land resources, but something that's allowed by the zoning could. So I need you to weigh in on your thoughts.
So you're again, it allows construction, so some construction could involve this activity now. For example, G, that would be no, because we don't have coastal erosion hazard area. But certainly someone has the ability to come in and do construction on a slope of 15% or greater, right?
Well, we have the environmental overlay that we've added that specifically establishes development standards for steep slopes. So this zoning law actually controls development on steep slopes when we never had that before.
So the impact, if anything, is going to be positive, not negative.
Well,
Instead of asking that, why don't we just say, well, how would the question best be answered?
Yeah, I mean,
No or yes?
well, yes.
No or small, or no to.
Well, the very, you're talking the very first question without getting into
Oh,
some
yes.
parts. Does
Okay.
the adoption of the zoning law involve construction on or physical alteration of the land surface?
And that's why I picked B and G. G would be a definite no. B is the question. And you're saying now that there's the overlay that says there are restrictions on slopes. So that would be a no answer because it's a positive.
Right.
So it would be yes, but through A through H are no. No or small impact, right?
But in the aggregate, it'd be no.
in the aggregate, you know. because-
Right, I mean, you have, this is always the issue that we go through on, you know, whether we take it at simply adopting the law so it's in place versus how the law is implemented over time.
Yes, but also as compared to what's allowed, I mean, construction is allowed now, you know?
Right,
So it has to be viewed through a prism of, in some senses, a relative comparison between what is being proposed in the new zoning law versus what's allowed to happen under the present zoning law. So for instance, using the steep slopes, which is not really controlled under the present zoning law, and it will be under the new zoning law if you adopt it. So that's actually going to be a plus, so, you know.
So aren't these all no?
So the answer is
No.
Puts it to no, yeah.
Seems to me to be no.
move on to question 2.
Is there one copy of this we're going to use as a,
you mean as like a master copy?
yeah?
I could keep that, or
Yes,
do you have a
do
paper copy, you know?
Oh, yeah.
And I also, you know, any kind of comment.
Why don't you keep it and then you can circulate it?
Okay. All right, and then any kind of commentary that supports how you answered the questions. If we can capture that in the notes, that would, I think, be helpful for the record.
Just we'll, of course, become more accustomed to this process as we go through it and become more streamlined. But I just would like to use this as an opportunity for John on F there. My read of the current law is this is actually neutral. As you said, on B, which is on slope, and when it comes to the water table at 3 feet, the new law is more restrictive. But on F, this is actually neutral. I think this is same, right? And so because it's no change, it's as it was, it still is, then it doesn't cause a negative.
Correct.
Right.
So no is a good answer.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
On H, other impacts, I really can't think of any, but I'm just wondering if other municipalities you folks have worked with have come up with other impacts that are obvious in terms of all these changes.
Sometimes the communities have used that other to make a statement, like we now have an overlay zone that offers further protection to whatever the resource is. So sometimes they use that other as an opportunity to point out where there are positive changes they think are going to happen. So I think that's...
Well, that's a good
Yeah.
point.
Maybe we should do that.
So, you know, what DEC really wants you to be doing as part of this process is that they have these questions, they've designed a framework for you to use as guidance. And the EAF Part 2 is kind of a checklist to make sure that every lead agency, at least, you know, these are potential issues that have to be considered because you're going through the form. But you'll see in the seeker handbook, you know, DEC says on a number of different occasions that you shouldn't feel constrained by, you know, they didn't dream that they could think of every impact on the form. And so you shouldn't be constrained if something comes to you that isn't provided on the form. So you should just know that you have the freedom, to raise other issues if that comes to you through the course of your review. It's kind of hard, now that doesn't really make a lot of sense on this particular topic item because it's so incongruous with, what the zoning law is doing. But these